And hi, yogis and interested mindfulness folk out there. Again, I'm responding from a request from a student to talk a little bit about the relationship of sound to yoga, what we call sabda, and how it kind of goes all the way back to the Vedic, about 1,200 years before the Common Era, when mantra was a primary part of the ritual practice of the ancient Indians, the ancient Aryans, and how they used mantra in a very careful way to begin with, to structure reality through sound, through mantra structure, through precise execution and pronunciation of mantras, in the ritual placement of what they called the Agnihotra, the fire ritual, and walked through often magical religious activity where they were giving spells or giving blessings or asking the gods for concrete favors, like having a proper spouse or getting somebody to fall in love with you, or having riches or the kindness of the gods or healing or good crops. So that's ancient tradition. And that's sets a tone for the later tradition, because mantra becomes linked with worldly aims. But when we get into Sramana tradition, when we get into the tradition of the yogis, which emerges around the middle of the first millennium before the birth of Christ, things start to shift. There not only becomes a focus on transcendence rather than worldly satisfaction, health, wealth, love, and happiness, but also a departure from the emphasis on mantra. Mantra becomes linked ideationally with the getting of goods, the getting of goodness in the horizontal plane rather than moving up to the transcendent plane. But there are exceptions to this rule. So Yoga Sutra, of course, gives us tasya vachaha pranavaha in the first chapter, verse 27, Sutra 27, and it tells us that it indicates pranava indicates it, which relates to the previous sutra, which, and we usually interpret it as saying Om is indicative of the Lord, of the transcendent, of the ultimate. So we get that clear back in Yoga Sutras. It says that because it's referring to a previous sutra where they mentioned the Guru of Gurus, which is Ishvara, the Lord. So we take it that 27 is referring to that. So we get that in Yoga Sutras. And then in the third chapter, or the chapter on the Bhutipada, of the kind of transcendent powers or worldly powers, really, in Yoga Sutra, we get 317, where it says word, object, and mental content are confused, and using the meditation of samyama on them separately allows one to attain the knowledge of the language of all living beings. So we get that in 317, which kind of foreshadows what will happen in Hemachandra's Yoga Shastra of the 11th century, when we get a kind of cosmology of the body that relates to the Hindu alphabet or the Sanskrit alphabet, in which the chakras of the body are each constructed of phonemes, of sound. It's the sabda sarira, it's the sound body of the human, though that kind of references back Tantra, where all through that whole Tantra period where Tantra Marga happened, the path of, or rather Mantra Marga happened, where the path of the mantras happened in the whole Tantra period from about 200 up to about Hemachandra's period, actually into 1000 and beyond. We had a huge focus on mantra, but again, in the tradition, it was much used for worldly power and realization, though there definitely were transcendent elements in that period as well. But when we get to Hemachandra's Yoga Shastra, we get this somatic design of the body, which relates to the chakra system, in which the dalas, the petals of the lotuses, of the flowers of the chakras, each contain a Sanskrit phoneme. And by chanting these, you can attain enlightenment, because you kind of wake up through seed mantras, bija mantras, wake up each set of lotuses so that you attain realization. And then in other texts, we get that process reversed in that one can dissolve the body, dissolve the being by going through that process in a negative way, disassembling the chakras, which hold the body in incarnation, and therefore allows one to dissolve into Brahman through a death process, through leaving the body, through dissolving the body. So we get the use of mantra in the yoga tradition, Hatha Yoga tradition, which begins in the 11th century, but mostly it is eliminated. We mostly get a departure from mantra in Dattatreya Yoga Shastra of the 13th century. It tells us, and this is kind of a marker for the larger tradition, clear back and clear forward, sort of like I said about the Sramanas, it says that the focus on mantra can slow down your progress in yoga, that you need to undertake these harder hatha practices. You don't want to go the easy path. That's for the low lives. It literally says that, lowly people. It's kind of the everyman's technique. And so, of course, we also see that in bhakti yoga, and we see that in the present in bhakti yoga when we look at the manifestation of kirtan. It's very much an everyman's practice and every person's practice where everybody can join in. You can be with people. It's a very social experience, and you chant and everybody feels good, and it's a transcendent practice because you move into vibration with the ultimate, with Brahman. But of course, the Hatha Yoga tradition is very bodily. It's very much a somatic practice. So it sees itself as a superior practice to the kind of everyman's practice of mantra. So it emphasizes other techniques, which we know about, asana, pranayama, mudra, in those somatic practices, also shat karma, the deep cleansings of the body, it sees itself as moving more quickly towards the transcendent. Ooh. So we've moved over about a 2,000-year period from the early material in the Vedas, 1,200 years before the birth of Christ, before the Common Era, into about 1,000, and even up into the later Hatha Yoga tradition, which is kind of formulated, the early tradition from about 11th century up to the 15th century. 15th century gets its classical formulation, Hatha Yoga Pradipika. And in that period, we see a departure from the mantra tradition of Tantra, previous 1,000 years to 800 years or so, and a profound departure from the Vedic tradition of creating ritual to manifest worldly goods. Though there is a focus on, as it were, para, madhyama, pashyanti, and vaikari, the subtle elements of sound. And we see that very dramatically in the classical yoga text, Hatha Yoga Pradipika, where 29 times it tells us about nada. It says that nada is synonymous with the transcendent state, with the experience of the ultimate. It doesn't teach us about mantra explicitly in the outward form, the vaikari form. It focuses on that inner form, that para form. So that underlies, that understanding of the subtle states of sound, the gross states of sound, underlies this teaching in the classical yoga tradition. When we arrive in Hatha Yoga Pradipika in 1450 or so of the Common Era, when mantra is dropped away, but a focus on the inner sound, the inner vibration, which plays with this idea of the sound body, the sabda sarira, and references perhaps even more deeply the idea of urta, the rhythm of the universe, which comes from the Vedic texts, and translates it into a Hatha Yoga practice, which is based on somatic experience, but which attains a state which is vibrational, which it calls nada. All right, I guess that covers it. So today we're starting to look at the way that toning and other sound practices can create coherence, electromagnetic coherence between the brain and the heart. And that's kind of the cutting edge of science, as well as binaural beats and focus on 432 hertz and these other sound practices, sound healing. But in the yoga tradition, we don't quite jump into those sets of more modern scientific knowledge. But there is, of course, mantra repetition, and sometimes it does use like polyrhythms, like tuvan singing from the Tibetan tradition, of sounds, and those are said to be part of manifesting higher vibration in the body. We can think about that as being used in, like in murcha, the resonation, no, brahmari, the resonation. It's like the B. We see that in Hatha Yoga Pradipika. So some of that comes in. It's kind of foreshadowed what we're doing in the modern day. Okay, we moved from Veda, the use of careful mantras to create ritual for worldly attainment, Tantra, which is the path of the mantras, the mantra marga, into the Hatha Yoga tradition, which eschews mantra because it sees it associated with householder traditions, with worldly traditions, though it focuses on nada, the transcendent sound, the para element of sound. All right, that was quite a junket. I'm glad you traveled it with me. I hope that was somehow coherent and that you see a little bit of the progression of the use of sound from the early tradition to the later tradition, right up to our kind of modern focus on chanting Om in class and using a little bit of kirtan for devotional tradition, bhakti tradition. I'm Eric Shaw, signing off. See you in the next video. Hari Om Tat Sat.